Ora bem, hoje vamos ver aqui como fosse a segunda parte ou a terceira parte, que eu já fiz outros sobre o DLSS e o FSR, as variantes, das evoluções também dos mesmos. Agora estamos na versão 4 de ambos, tanto no FSR 4 como no DLSS 4. Não esquecer que o FSR 4 só vai funcionar nas novas gráficas da AMD, portanto da série 9000. Portanto, tenham em atenção esse aspecto. Enquanto que o DLSS 4, apesar da gráfica não, as séries 5 são as que vêm desenhadas, nós podemos usar o DLSS 4 em versões anteriores. Já fiz o vídeo sobre isso, ok? Então, sem mais longas, vamos ver aqui o vídeo do hardware unbox e depois ir comentando. Não se esqueçam de ver o vídeo completo dele, porque como sabem eu não transmito o vídeo todos, porque eu acho que vocês têm que ir ver, porque é para dar créditos a eles, como é óbvio. Ora, são sem mais longas. Alto.
And FSR4 with a look at how the upscalers compare at 1080p, which is still a very popular resolution.
E vamos fazer em 1080p, que está para cair, não é? Antigamente o DLSS 4, neste caso o 3, e o FSR 3 a 1080p eram muito mau, especialmente o FSR 3. O DLSS 2 também era mau, o 3 também era mau, ok? 1080p a malta evitava, ou quando muito metia estas opções na versão qualidade para ter a melhor resolução possível. Ele aqui vai buscar renderização. Eu vou aumentar talvez isto, não? Yeah. Vão pôr, vai apresentar informação do jogo na versão tradicional, portanto sem nenhum upscaling. Depois vão buscar aqui o antigo, o 3.5 e o FSR 2.2. Isto era horrível, ok? Dá para ver na imagem parada caso das costas do boneco é muito mau em relação ao 3.5, certo? Mas nas versões novas isto quase não se vai notar, tá bem? Não se esqueçam que o vídeo, para ver estes detalhes, convém ver diretamente do site deles, para terem a qualidade melhor, não é? A ver, aqui ainda as versões mais antigas ainda, 2.5, a 0, vamos abdicar de dizer logo este, e este é o 2.1, mesmo em qualidade, pá, ambos eles eram maus, mas o FSR era bem pior ainda, não é? Dá para ver que, pá, especialmente em cabelos, vegetação, notava-se bem. Ele vai ser então na 9000, neste caso a 9070 XT, e estas as últimas, uma 5090, ok? Aqui vai só focar apenas nas qualidades de imagens, que são os FPS, porque uma 5090 contra uma 9070 XT é brincadeira, não é? Mas pronto. Vai fazer publicidade, já sabem, vejam diretamente deles, ok? Aqui DLSS 3, ok? FSR 4 e DLSS 4, certo? O FSR 4 comparado com o DLSS 4 é quase ela por ela. Não esqueçam que há jogos em que, por exemplo, o FSR 4 até perde para a versão 3. Significa que o jogo ainda não melhorou. Muita atenção. O 4 normalmente está sempre acima do 3. Uma coisa rara, uma coisa ou outra rara, mas tudo bem. Não esquecer que estamos a falar em 1080p, que tenho que dizer sempre.
TAA-based tech, there was a noticeable difference between the sharpness and clarity of the image depending on whether you were standing still or moving.
Mas o FSR 4 e o DLSS 4 estão muito bons agora. Podem jogar em modo performance ou balanceado até se quiserem.
With DLSS4 and FSR4, there is a much smaller difference between standing still and moving in terms of clarity, effectively removing the TAA blur we see in motion, resulting in a more detailed, higher quality presentation
É,
as you actually move around
o
the
FSR 4 aqui neste jogo até bate o DLSS 3, né?
to say this is also true when using these
Eu
technologies.
acho que o que evoluiu mais foi o FSR 4, isso é verdade.
DLSS3 is quite blurry in motion even when using the quality mode, and there's a noticeable drop in clarity as soon as you start moving. With FSR4 and DLSS4, the clarity is much improved. Now,
Este jogo eu não
DLSS4
jogo.
has superior technology at 1080p for texture clarity and TAA blur. Generally, the image is a little sharper than FSR4, but FSR4 is also a huge upgrade over
As
DLSS4.
vegetações batem muito forte.
Really impressed me here. It looks great. Like we found at higher resolutions, this blur reducing capability is basically unchanged at lower modes. So even using the performance mode at 1080p looks a lot clearer than DLSS 3.
Não,
And this is still true of
detalhes são muito bons.
DLSS 4. The FSR3 performance mode was essentially unusable, whereas with FSR4, the clarity is decent and the game looks to be running at a reasonable resolution. When it comes to stability and fine detail, there is a pretty consistent theme when assessing the 1080p footage. DLSS 4 is a significant leap forward compared to DLSS 3. Often at 1080p, DLSS 3 would really struggle to keep the image stable in motion, resulting in aliasing, shimmering, or sizzling, even
É,
using the quality.
nota-se.
Typically, this meant DLSS 3 upscaling was a visual downgrade compared to native rendering. DLSS 4 is much more stable in comparison, and you're less likely to spot issues like aliasing or shimmering at 1080p using the quality mode. This really opens the door for DLSS to be truly viable at a 1080p resolution, as it not only provides better clarity in motion with less TAA blur, but a more stable presentation as well. Of course, it's not fully free of artifacts. The low render resolution at
É,
play here
os carros
certainly
também.
are some issues compared to what you'd see at 4K, but in normal gameplay, I was very happy with the quality of DLSS 4 at 1080p. FSR 4 is more of a mixed bag when it comes to stability, and it's clearly not as solid as DLSS 4 at this resolution. How it compares to DLSS 3 using the quality mode depends on the game or even the specific part of the game. For example, in this panning shot in The Last of Us Part 1, towards the start of the scene, FSR 4 is less stable than DLSS 3, but towards the end of the scene, it's more stable. In both cases, DLSS 4 looks noticeably better.
É.
As
De jogo para jogo pode haver alterações.
I believe FSR4 is more stable in a general sense, especially when you see the impact of the mild swaying as you move around. FSR4 handles that better than DLSS.
Não se esqueçam que isto está com zoom,
In a
ok?
game like Spider-Man 2, it's less stable, and in Ratchet & Clank, it's pretty close to DLSS 3, maybe slightly better. Now, DLSS 3 levels of stability from FSR 4 still results in better image quality overall, as FSR 4 is much less blurry, so the image in general is more detailed, but AMD still needs to put in some work here to recreate the cleanness we're seeing from DLSS 4 at this resolution. What I will say though is that the FSR 4 performance mode isn't too bad, and doesn't fall away nearly as hard as FSR 3.
Não esquecer que quando aumentarem a resolução, portanto 1440p, 4K, as diferenças podem se esbater.
3 did for stability at 1080p. In the worst cases, FSR4 performance is similar to DLSS3 performance, and in the best cases, it's actually quite a bit more stable and sits between DLSS3 and 4. I personally wouldn't choose to use this mode, but it's not that bad considering the render resolution is just 540p. Disocclusion at 1080p is really no different to what we saw at higher resolutions. This is the main area where DLSS 4 struggles compared to DLSS 3, with an obvious downgrade visible at this resolution. There is more sizzling and blurring around characters in third-person games, and as objects disocclude, you're more likely to notice artifact or blur trails in motion, which isn't necessarily ghosting, but a byproduct of DLSS 4's weaker handling of disocclusion. Comparing the three upscalers using the quality mode, in my opinion, FSR4 usually looks the best, though at times it's not hugely different to the DLSS.
Aqui o FSR 4
Examining FSR4
ganha.
relative to DLSS 4, and AMD's upscaler clearly handles disocclusion better, and you can notice this in real-time, non-zoomed footage using the quality mode. Of course, like all artifacts, the degree to which FSR4 is better changes between
Não, eu acho que o FSR 4 está muito bom.
in Horizon
Muito bom.
Zero Dawn than The
A
Last
crítica é só funcionar nas série 9000.
DLSS4 to outperform FSR4 in this area. To make matters worse, disocclusion artifacts tend to get worse at lower modes like the performance mode. Here are the blur trails as a wire passes over some bricks using the quality mode, and here's the same artifact using the performance mode. The lower render resolution results in more noticeable blur trails, and this is why it's hard to recommend the DLSS 4 performance mode at 1080p. These artifacts can be really noticeable in this configuration, much more so than using the same mode at 4K. Hair quality is also very similar to other resolutions in that FSR4 and DLSS4 end up looking pretty
Cabelo.
similar. DLSS4 can be a little sharper and more stable at times,
Ver. DLSS 4 é muito bom.
but if the hair is prone to disocclusion, that's where FSR4 can end up looking better. The big win here for AMD's technology is that hair no longer looks extremely grainy, which was a significant issue with FSR3. Across both FSR4 and DLSS4, we're getting an upgrade compared to DLSS3, which can be a bit aliased for hair. Particle and rain quality is also similar to other resolutions.
Isto não ligo muito as partículas.
In The Last of Us Spore test,
Acho que os jogos agora trazem partículas a mais, diga-se de passagem.
particles and less ghosting. However, FSR4 produced more ghosting, looking at Ratchet and Clank confetti, with more aliasing as well relative to DLSS4, which ended up looking
mais para a frente, não?
In the Horizon Zero Dawn snow test, FSR4 and DLSS4 end up looking pretty similar in terms of the quality of the snow particles, while DLSS3 has slightly less clarity, as we've seen through most of these examples. DLSS4 is stronger at reconstructing the background behind the snow, so the grass and trees look a bit more natural compared to FSR4, but this difference is pretty hard to spot unless you're looking for it. In general, the upscaler does a decent job at particles. At 1080p, upscale transparencies are pretty similar between DLSS3, DLSS4, and FSR4 when using the quality mode. Elements like fire and holograms are reconstructed pretty well, though there can be some aliasing, grain, and blur in motion depending on the technique. Based on what I've seen, I don't think one technique is clearly better than the others, which is similar to what we've found at higher resolution.
Eu tenho a dizer que tenham atenção os jogos que vocês querem. Como a tecnologia pode ser melhor numa e ser pior noutra. Muita atenção.
Compared to FSR4, such as in the fire in Horizon Zero Dawn or the holograms in Ratchet and Clank. At the lowest render resolutions, this can give FSR4 the edge, which was a surprise to me considering how badly FSR3 handled transparencies at 1080p. Foliage quality, especially grass, is one of the hardest things to upscale at 1080p.
As folhagens.
Looking aliased or grainy in motion. Like we've seen at other resolutions, FSR4 tends to hold up the best for grass using the quality mode, though it does trade blows with DLSS4 in some titles. For example, in Hunt Showdown, grass is quite grainy and is prone to shimmering in the DLSS3 image, whereas both FSR4 and DLSS...
A ver. Entre esta e esta, esta aqui é que muito má.
are much more stable and less grainy. I also gave a small edge to FSR4 in Horizon Zero Dawn compared to DLSS3, though ultimately both are very close. It can flip the other way in some other examples, like The Last of Us Part 1, where DLSS4 delivers the best image stability for grass, though in my opinion FSR4 is still superior to DLSS3. The softness of DLSS3 in this example kills the detail in the grass.
O DLSS3 está completamente ultrapassado.
Tree quality, though, is generally where DLSS4 takes the lead due to better image stability and more detail. In examples like Spider-Man 2, Horizon Zero Dawn, and The Last of Us, tree branches and leaves are less prone to shimmering in DLSS4 relative to FSR4, the latter of which is closer to DLSS3 in its output. I wouldn't say FSR4 is horrible or anything here, it's just going to produce stability similar to some of the earlier examples that we looked at. None of the upscalers are particularly great at handling fine tree branches in motion at 1080p, with all producing significant levels of aliasing even using the quality.
Mas o 4 já está muito bom.
A better fine detail reconstruction when stationary, but that's far less relevant than the aliasing seen in motion, considering you mostly play games by moving around. FSR4 probably...
Esta é uma das situações em que a malta não gosta, principalmente nos first-person shooters, usar os DLSS, os FSR. Isso é diferente.
Compared to DLSS4. So depending on the type of fence, one or the other element will be the dominant factor in how the fence is upscaled. For example, in The Last of Us with this thicker iron fence, this is mostly a stability problem. And you'll see here at 1080p quality mode that DLSS4 is much more stable, whereas FSR4 is closer to or even worse than DLSS3 in how it reconstructs this element. But if we move to Spider-Man 2 with a thin chicken wire fence, now there are times where DLSS4 upscales this and it ends up quite blurry, whereas FSR4 is plays cleaner and shows more of the background. There are other times
Exato.
where the stability angle is more at play and DLSS 4 does a better job.
A qualidade fica sempre muito bom.
Somewhere between DLSS 3 and 4 in overall fence quality, but it's a good example of how these specific areas to upscaling can play out with one type of item that's common across games. Lastly, I wanted to show some examples of FSR4 versus FSR 3.1, because throughout the video so far, I've focused on FSR4 versus DLSS, largely because FSR 3.1 is so bad at 1080p that it's basically irrelevant in the upscaling discussion. But for the sake of completeness, let's see how far FSR4 has come. It's very apparent with just a few examples that FSR4 is
Ah,
a night and day difference compared to FSR 3.1.
não, acho que é muito melhor.
FSR 3 just looks horrible at 1080p. There is so much shimmering and aliasing that it looks like you're playing at a much lower resolution, defeating the purpose of upscaling. FSR 4 is nowhere near as aliased, it actually looks decent and playable, and this applies across every game we've looked at. What's even more striking is that the FSR 4 performance mode at 1080p is still noticeably superior to FSR 3.1 using the quality mode,
É.
which is one of those
O
scenarios
3.1 está despassado completamente.
the release of FSR 4. I'm not even going to show the FSR 3.1 performance mode because it's offensively bad. FSR 4 has well and truly buried older versions. Overall, upscaling at a 1080p resolution has come a long way in 2025 thanks to the release of FSR4 and DLSS 4. These new upscalers are much better at handling lower resolutions like 1080p compared to previous versions, with significant strides taken in overall clarity, blur, stability, and detail. A couple of years ago, it was very much hit or miss as to whether upscaling was worth using at 1080p, because the quality loss relative to native rendering could be very noticeable in some games. These days, if you're using the latest version, I think upscaling is quite viable and usable across the board for 1080p gaming. DLSS 4 is the real star of the show here and is the best upscaler for 1080p gaming. It's quite amazing how much more stable DLSS 4 is at 1080p compared to DLSS 3, even when using the higher modes such as quality, though there are massive improvements to the performance mode as well. DLSS 4 not only removes a lot of the TAA blur that's typically associated with modern 1080p gaming, making the overall
O
presentation
FSR, o primeiro, é tal situação de só funcionar na série 9000.
in most situations, this makes DLSS 4 the better way to play than native TAA rendering because the overall presentation is superior and performance is better. FSR 4 is also quite good at 1080p and is an enormous improvement over FSR 3.1 at this resolution. FSR 3.1 was basically unusable at 1080p in my opinion, even with the quality mode, which was a real issue for AMD considering Radeon's popularity in the cheaper parts of the GPU market, where gamers are more
É,
likely to play.
mas já sabem, vão ouvir o vídeo dele para ver o vídeo todo e para lhes dar crédito para eles, porque eu acho que é isso que eles merecem. Esta explicação está muito boa, não é? Portanto, já sabem.